The Yearling, Chapter 21. For 2 weeks, Penny concerned himself with the salvaging of crops. The sweet potatoes were not ready by 2 months for digging, but they were rotting and would be a total loss if they were not dug. Jody worked long hours at them. He must be careful to go deeply enough with the potato fork and not go too close to the middle of the beds. Then, by lifting carefully, he brought up a forkful of potatoes unharmed. When they were all dug, Ma Baxter spread them out to dry and cure as best they could on the back porch. They all had to be gone over and more than half discarded. Rotting ends were cut off with the nubbins set aside for the hogs. The sugar cane was flattened to the ground. There was nothing to do for the present but leave it, for it was immature. It was already putting out roots along the stalks, but it could be trimmed and salvaged later. The cowpea hay was ruined. It had been near maturity, and the week's soaking left it on the ground, a moldy mass. The peas that the Baxters had shelled were the only salvage. 3 weeks after the flood, after good days of sun, Penny took his scythe to Mullet Prairie, as he now called it, and cut marsh grass and left it to cure. "Good fodder in bad times," he said. The prairie waters had receded and left no trace of fish, except their stench. Even Jody, whom few odors offended, was sickened. The smell of death lay everywhere. Penny said uneasily, "Something's wrong. That stink's due to be done with. Things is yet doing. Things is yet dying. Things is yet dying." A month after the flood in October, he returned with Jody in the wagon beside him to Mullet Prairie to gather the cut and cured hay. Rip and Julia trotted along behind the wagon. Penny allowed Flag, too, to follow, for he had begun to make great commotion whenever he was shut up and left behind in the shed. He ran, sometimes ahead of old Caesar, sometimes, when the road was wide enough, beside him. Now and then he dropped back and frolicked with the dogs. He had learned to eat green stuff, and he stopped occasionally to nibble a tender bud or sprout. Jody said, "Look back at him, Pa, pulling buds like he was growed." Penny smiled and said, "I tell you, never were such a phone." Suddenly old Julia gave a tongue and tore to the right into the bushes. Rip followed, and Penny halted the wagon. "Go see what them fools is after, Jody." Jody jumped down and went after them. A few yards beyond, he was able to identify the trail. He called, "Nothing but cat." Penny lifted his horn to blow the dogs in when he heard Julia bay. He dismounted and pushed into the thick growth. The dogs had the cat at bay, but there was no fight. He went to them. Jody stood puzzled. The wildcat lay on its side, untouched. Julia and Rip circled, nipping but with no responding attack. The cat bared its teeth and lashed its tail, but did not stir. It was gaunt and weak. Penny said, "The creature's dying. Leave it be." He called off the dogs and returned to the wagon. Jody asked, "What's it dying of, Pa?" "Why, the creatures dies the same as us. Them as ain't kilt by their enemies. He's likely old and couldn't catch hisself nothing to feed on." "His teeth wasn't wore down like a old creature." Penny looked at him. "Boy, you getting real observing. Now I like to see that." There was still no explanation of the wildcat's feebleness. They reached the prairie and loaded the wagon with hay. Penny estimated that 3 more trips would be necessary. The marsh hay was coarse and stringy, but when the frost had come and the wiregrass was dry and harsh, Caesar and Trixie and the heifer calf would be glad to have it. They drove toward home leisurely. Old Caesar quickened his gait, and even Julia ran on ahead, eager, as all domestic animals, for home. Past the trail to the sinkhole, At the corner of the first fence row, Julia lifted her nose and bayed. Penny said, "Now there'd be nothing there in broad daylight." Julia was insistent and jumped the fence and stopped. Her bay turned to a shrill barking. Rip, clumsy in bulldog fashion, clambered over the fence that the hound had cleared lightly. He too barked fiercely. Penny said, "Well, I know better than to question a good dog's sense." He stopped the wagon and took up his gun and went with Jody over the fence to the dogs. A buck deer lay in the corner. It shook its head, making a menacing motion with its horns. Penny lifted his gun, then lowered it. "Now that buck's sick, too." He approached close, and the deer did not move. Its tongue lolled. Julia and Rip were in a frenzy. They could not understand the refusal of live game either to run or to fight. No use to waste shot. He took his knife from his scabbard and went to the deer and slit its throat. It died with the quiet of a thing to whom death is only one short step beyond the present misery. He drove off the dogs and examined it carefully. Its tongue was black and swollen. Its eyes were red and watery. It was as thin as the dying wildcat. He said, "This is worse than I figured. A plague has hit the wild creatures. It's a black tongue." Jody had heard of human plagues. The wild animals had always seemed to him to be charmed and beyond all human ills. A creature died in the chase, or when another creature more powerful pounced and destroyed. Death in the scrub was clean and violent, never a slow sickness and lingering. He stared down at the dead deer. He said, "We'll not eat it, will we?" Penny shook his head. "'Tain't fittin'." The dogs were sniffing farther down the fence row. Julia barked again. Penny looked after her. A pile of carcasses lay in a heap. 2 old bucks and a yearling had died together. Jody had seldom seen his father's face so grave. Penny examined the plague-killed deer and turned away without speaking. Death seemed to have appeared wholesale out of the air. "What done it, Pa? What killed 'em?" Again Penny shook his head. "I've never knowed what give the black tongue. Maybe it's flood water, full of dead things, has got poisonous." A fear shot through Jody like a hot knife. "Pa, Flag, he'll not get it, will he?" "Son, I've told you all I know." They returned to the wagon and drove on and into the lot and unloaded the hay. Jody felt weak and sick. Flag bleated. He went to him and clutched him around the neck and held him tightly until the fawn pulled away for breath. Jody whispered, "Don't get it. Please don't get it." At the house, Ma Baxter received the news stolidly. She had shed her tears and wailed her laments when the crops were ruined. As the going of too many of her children had wrung her dry feeling, now the passing of the game was only another unprotested incident. She said only, "Best water the stock from the high trough and not let 'em get to the seepage pool." Jody felt a hope for Flag. He would feed him only when he ate himself, keep him away from the tainted grass, water him from the Baxter's own drinking water. If Flag died, he thought with a mournful satisfaction, they would die together. He asked, "Do folkses get the black tongue?" "Only creatures." He tied Flag stoutly to the shed when he made the next trip in the wagon for hay. Penny tied up the dogs as well. Jody asked countless questions. Would the hay be tainted? Would the plague last forever? Would there be any game left? To all, Penny, who knew he had thought almost everything, shook his head in ignorance. "Keep still, boy, for the Lord's sake. A thing's happened has never happened before. How would e'er a man know the answers?" His father left him alone to take hay and load the wagon while he unhitched Caesar and rode on to the foresters for information. Jody felt uneasy and miserable, alone at the edge of the marsh. The world seemed empty. Only over the scrub the buzzards wheeled, profiting. He hurried at his work and had finished it long before his father returned. He climbed to the top of the load of hay and lay flat on his back, staring at the sky. He decided that the world was a very peculiar place to live in. Things happened that had no reason and made no sense and did harm, like the bears and panthers, but without their excuse of hunger. He did not approve. Against the uncomfortable and alarming things that happened, he balanced Flag. His father, too, of course, but Flag lived in a secret place in his heart that had been long aching and vacant. If Flag were not stricken with the plague, the flood, he decided, would be interesting. If he lived to be as old as Penny, as old as Grandma Hutto and Ma Forrester, he would never forget, he knew, the fright and enchantment of the endless days and nights of storm. He wondered if the quail would die of the black tongue. In another month his father had told him he might make a trap of crossed twigs and catch a few for eating. Shot was too valuable to be wasted on such small mouthfuls. But Penny would not allow them to be trapped until the covey was full grown, and he insisted each year that 2 or 3 pairs of cocks and hens be left for seed. And would the turkeys die? And the squirrels and the wolves and the bears and panthers? Speculation absorbed him. When a muffled sound in the distance became the recognizable beat of old Caesar's hooves, he had forgotten his discomfort. Penny was as grave as before, but he was relieved and stimulated by his talk with the foresters. On the trail of game for food, they had discovered the condition 2 days before. No breed of animals, they said, had been spared. They had found the predatory creatures dead or dying beside their quarry, on an equal footing at last, the weak and the strong brought together to earth, the sharp-toothed and the dull, the clawless and the clawed. Jody asked, "Will everything die?" Penny spoke sharply. "I told you the last time, don't ask me them questions. Wait, like me, and see." And that's the end of chapter 21. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.